The screams echoed through the metal corridors of the prison ship as another fighter was dragged away from the arena. Jake Harrison pressed his face against the small window of his cell and watched the blood being washed from the sandy floor. Below, the crowd was already leaving, their thirst for violence satisfied for another day. In 3 hours, they would return for the next fight. Jake had been counting the days since his capture. 47 days of watching other prisoners die in the Crimson Coliseum. 47 days of waiting for his own name to be called. The Zephyrians who ran this floating death trap seemed to enjoy keeping him in suspense. They had never seen a human before, and they wanted to study him first. The arena was the crown jewel of the Zephyrian Empire's entertainment industry. Ships from across 17 different worlds brought spectators to watch creatures tear each other apart for sport. Governor Kane Mitchell, a fat man with cold eyes and expensive clothes, had built his fortune on this blood-soaked business. He sat in his luxury box every day, counting his profits while beings died below. But there was one fighter who made Mitchell richer than all the others combined. They called it the Silent One, and Jake had watched it kill dozens of opponents without ever making a sound. The creature was something from nightmares, 12 feet tall with black scales that reflected light like oil on water. It had 6 arms that ended in claws sharp enough to cut through steel. Its head was angular and alien, with large eyes that seemed to see everything. What made it truly terrifying was not just its size or strength. It was the way it fought. There was no rage, no excitement, no emotion at all. It moved with mechanical precision, studying its opponent for weaknesses, then striking with surgical accuracy. Most fights lasted less than 5 minutes. The creature would disable its opponent with calculated strikes, then deliver a single killing blow. Clean, efficient, silent. Jake had watched 23 of these executions. Each time he found himself studying the creature more carefully. Other prisoners would turn away or close their eyes when the Silent One entered the arena. They whispered stories about it in the dark corners of their cells. Some said it was a machine built by the Zephyrians. Others claimed it was possessed by evil spirits. A few believed it had once been different, before something broke its mind. The truth was, none of them really knew what it was or where it came from. The arena announcers called it a Vorak from some distant world, but they gave no other details. Mitchell liked the mystery. It made the crowds bigger and the betting more intense. People paid extra to see the legendary killer that never spoke. Never showed pain, never showed mercy. Jake noticed things the crowds missed. During his weeks of observation, he had developed a habit of watching not just the fights, but everything around them. His military training had taught him to look for patterns and details that others ignored. While spectators focused on the violence, Jake studied the participants. The Silent One never took longer than necessary to kill. When facing multiple opponents, it would eliminate the most dangerous threats first, but it never played with its victims. There was no cruelty in its methods, no unnecessary suffering. It killed quickly and moved on. This was not the behavior of a mindless beast. More interesting were the moments between fights. Jake could see into the creature's holding area from his cell window. While other fighters paced or raged or cowered, the Silent One sat motionless in the center of its cage. But Jake noticed its eyes. They were always moving, always observing. It watched the guards, studied their routines, observed the other prisoners. This was not the behavior of a broken mind. Most telling of all were the creature's eyes when it looked up at Jake's window. In those brief moments of eye contact, Jake saw something that chilled him more than any display of violence. He saw intelligence. Deep, profound, ancient intelligence trapped behind layers of carefully constructed numbness. The guards came for Jake on a Tuesday. He had been expecting this moment for weeks, but it still sent ice through his veins when the cell door opened. Two Zephyrian soldiers in heavy armor gestured for him to move. Jake stood slowly, his legs stiff from the cramped conditions. They led him through corridors he had only seen from his window. The walls were covered with posters advertising upcoming fights, featuring snarling beasts and dramatic titles. Jake saw his own name on one of them. Human versus the Silent Death. First, contact special event. The date was today. The preparation room was small and dirty. They gave him basic armor that had been worn by countless fighters before him. The metal plates were dented and scratched, stained with old blood that had never been properly cleaned. They handed him a simple sword, nothing fancy or high-tech. Governor Mitchell believed in keeping fights primitive for better entertainment value. Jake tested the sword's weight and balance. It was poorly made but functional. He had trained with similar weapons during his military service, though he had always preferred ranged combat to close-quarters fighting. Against a 12-foot-tall creature with 6 arms and razor claws, a sword seemed almost insulting. Through the preparation room's small window, Jake could see the arena filling up. This was clearly a special event. The crowd was larger than usual, with beings from dozens of different species taking their seats. News of a human fighter had spread quickly through the entertainment networks. Everyone wanted to see what this new species could do against the legendary Silent One. Governor Mitchell appeared on the viewing screens around the arena, his face twisted into what he probably thought was a charming smile. His voice boomed through the sound system as he introduced the evening's main event. He spoke about the humans' capture during a patrol mission, describing Jake like he was an exotic animal rather than a person. Then he began building up the Silent One, recounting its perfect record and legendary status. Jake tuned out the words and focused on his breathing. In a few minutes, he would be facing a creature that had never lost a fight. Military tactical. Training taught him to assess every situation objectively, and his assessment was not encouraging. He was smaller, weaker, and armed with inferior weapons. His only advantages were speed and intelligence, neither of which had helped the creature's previous opponents. But as Jake waited for his name to be called, he thought about those eyes he had seen through his cell window. Behind the mechanical killing machine was something more. Something that had once been different. If he was right about the intelligence he had glimpsed, then perhaps there was another way to approach this fight. The arena gates began to open. The crowd's roar grew louder as Jake walked toward the blood-soaked sand where so many had died before him. Across the arena, another gate was opening. The Silent One emerged from the shadows, moving with that same calculated precision Jake had observed for weeks. For the first time in 47 days of captivity, Jake smiled. The real test was about to begin. The guards separated them roughly after the failed fight, dragging Jake back to his cell while others used electric prods to force Thekmor into its cage. But Mitchell had made a mistake in his anger. He had placed their holding areas close enough that they could still communicate through the ventilation system. That first night, Jake pressed his ear to the wall and listened for any sound from his new friend. For hours, there was only silence. Then, just as Jake was beginning to worry, a voice came through the metal barriers. It was deep and rumbling like distant thunder, but the words were careful and precise. "Jake Harrison," Thekmor said. That is your name, yes. Yes, Jake replied, speaking toward a ventilation grate near his bed. And you are Thekmor. Tell me about that name. Tell me what it means. There was a long pause. When Thekmor spoke again, his voice carried centuries of pain. In my language, it means seeker of patterns. I was once a mathematician on my world. I studied the relationships between numbers and music, between geometry and beauty. I believed that understanding these patterns could help us understand the universe itself. Jake settled against the wall, making himself comfortable. This was going to be a long conversation, and he wanted to hear every word. What was your world like? Kepler 442b was old when your species was young, Thekmor began. We had cities that grew like crystals from the ground, following mathematical principles that made them both beautiful and efficient. Our libraries contained the collected wisdom of 60,000 years. We had art forms that your language has no words for, ways of expressing thought and emotion through combinations of sound, light, and molecular scent. The creature's voice grew softer as he described his home. Jake could hear the longing in every word. This was not the mechanical killer that the arena crowds feared. This was someone remembering Paradise Lost. I had a family, Thekmor continued, a mate named Silexta, who studied the patterns in weather systems. 3 offspring in different stages of development. My youngest, Vrenka, was just beginning to understand abstract concepts. She would ask me questions about infinity that made me think for hours. Jake felt his throat tighten. He had lost people too, but he could not imagine losing everything at once. What happened to them? The answer came after a very long silence. The Zephyrians came to our world in ships that blocked out the sun. They said we had resources they needed, but that was not the real reason. They came because we were intelligent enough to be entertaining when we died. Through the ventilation system, Jake could hear the creature's breathing change. The steady rhythm became faster and more ragged, as if the memories were causing physical pain. They killed my family in front of me, Thekmor said. Not quickly, like in the arena. Slowly, carefully, while their scientists recorded my responses. They wanted to see how much emotional trauma was required to break a Vorak mind. I was their test subject. Jake pressed his forehead against the cold metal wall. He had seen military reports about Zephyrian research facilities, but the clinical language of those documents had not prepared him for the reality of what they did. I am sorry, he said, knowing the words were inadequate. They kept me conscious throughout the process, Thekmor continued, his voice becoming distant and mechanical again. They used drugs to prevent me from losing awareness or falling into shock. They wanted me to experience every moment of grief and rage and helplessness. When my mate died, when my children died, I screamed until my voice was gone. I raged until I had no strength left. I begged them to kill me too. But they did not kill you. No. They had a different purpose for me. They had learned that Vorak minds, when properly broken, could become perfect weapons. We retain our intelligence and physical abilities, but lose our capacity for mercy or moral reasoning. They transported me from facility to facility, testing different methods of psychological conditioning. Jake understood now why the creature had been silent for so long. It had not been born a killer. It had been carefully crafted into one by beings who treated torture as a science. How long did this process take? 7 months, Thekmor replied. 7 months of systematic destruction of everything I had been. They showed me recordings of my family's death daily. They forced me to solve mathematical problems while experiencing artificial pain. They taught me to associate love, creativity, and compassion with suffering. The creature paused, and Jake could hear sounds that might have been weeping, though he was not sure if Vorak physiology allowed for tears. By the end, I wanted them to succeed, Thekmor admitted. I wanted to. Stop being Thekmor the mathematician, Thekmor the father, Thekmor the being who could feel pain. I wanted to become something that could not be hurt anymore. Jake felt his hands clenching into fists. The anger that filled him was not directed at Thekmor, but at the system that had created this situation. At Governor Mitchell, who profited from it. At the crowds who cheered for it. At the entire Zephyrian Empire that treated intelligent life as raw material for entertainment. But you are still you, Jake said firmly. Whatever they did to you, they did not succeed completely. I could see it in your eyes during our fight. The real Thekmor is still in there. For 3 years I convinced myself that Thekmor was dead, the creature replied. I told myself that my memories of family and home were delusions, that love and beauty were weaknesses that caused only pain. I forced myself to become exactly what they wanted me to be. What changed? Another long silence. When Thekmor spoke again, his voice was wondering, as if he was still trying to understand it. Himself. You sat down, he said simply. In all my time in the arena, no one had ever sat down. They charged at me with weapons, or tried to run away, or fell to their knees and begged for mercy. But you sat down and talked to me about mathematics and music. Jake smiled, though Thekmor could not see it. My brother always said that the best way to solve a problem was to approach it from an unexpected angle. Your brother sounds like he was wise. He was brave, Jake replied. Sometimes that is the same thing. They talked through the night, sharing stories of their lost loved ones and destroyed homes. Jake spoke of Earth's blue oceans and Danny's terrible jokes. Thekmor described the crystalline architecture of Vorak cities and the complex harmonies his family would create together in the evenings. As dawn approached, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of guards in the corridor. Mitchell was preparing new opponents for the next day's fights, hoping to break whatever bond had formed between the human and his former prizefighter. They will try to force us to fight again, Thekmor said. I know, Jake replied. Are you ready for that? I do not know if I can kill any more, the creature admitted. For 3 years, killing was easy because I felt nothing. But you have made me remember feeling. Now the thought of taking a life fills me with the pain I spent so long trying to avoid. Jake considered this carefully. He had been trained in military tactics, but he had also been trained in military ethics. There was an important difference between necessary violence and murder for entertainment. Then we find another way, he said finally. We fight to survive, but we do not fight to kill. We protect each other and look for opportunities to escape. The arena has security systems that make escape impossible, Thekmor pointed out. For one person, maybe, Jake replied. But we are not one person anymore. We are a team, and teams can accomplish things that individuals cannot. The sound of guards grew closer. Soon they would be separated for the day, forced to wait in their cells while Mitchell planned new torments. But something fundamental had changed during their night of conversation. Thekmor was no longer the silent one, the emotionless killing machine that had terrorized the arena for 3 years. He was Thekmor the mathematician, Thekmor the father, Thekmor the being who had remembered what it meant to feel love and loss. And Jake was no longer just a captured human pilot waiting to die. He was part of something bigger than himself, a friendship that had formed across species lines in the worst possible circumstances. The guards reached their section of the prison. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridors as the day shift began. Their duties. But Jake and Thecamore were no longer afraid. They had found something worth fighting for. The silence in the arena was deafening. Thousands of spectators sat motionless, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The legendary hellhounds, creatures that had never failed to kill their targets, lay dead around Jake and Thecamore. But more shocking than their victory was the way they had achieved it. Working together, protecting each other, creating strategies that neither could have developed alone. Governor Mitchell's face appeared on the arena screens, twisted with rage and desperation. His voice crackled through the speakers, but for the first time since Jake had been imprisoned, the governor sounded uncertain. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tomorrow we will present the ultimate challenge for these cooperative specimens." Jake looked up at the luxury box where Mitchell sat surrounded by his guards and advisors. Even from this distance, he could see the governor's hands shaking as he spoke. The man who had built his fortune on predictable violence was facing something he had never encountered before. Hope was contagious, and it was spreading through his carefully controlled environment like a virus. That night, Jake and Thecamore were placed in adjacent cells for the first time. The guards claimed it was a security measure, but Jake suspected that Mitchell wanted them to plan together so he could monitor their conversations. The governor was learning that cooperation could be as dangerous as any weapon. "He will try to force us to fight each other," Thecamore said as soon as the guards left. "It is the only option he has left." Jake nodded. He had reached the same conclusion during their walk back to the cells. "He cannot risk us working together again. The crowd saw what happened today. If word spreads that different species can fight as equals, it threatens the entire foundation of Zephyrian entertainment industry. More than that," Thecamore replied thoughtfully, "it threatens their entire philosophy of conquest. They justify enslaving other species by claiming we are naturally inferior, that cooperation between equals is impossible. Through their cell windows, they could see other prisoners watching them with new interest. Word of their victory had spread through the ship's prison levels within hours. Beings who had accepted their fate as arena fodder were beginning to whisper among themselves, sharing stories of their own lost homes and murdered families. Jake had been trained in psychological warfare during his military service. He recognized the signs of a population beginning to question their oppressors. The prisoners were no longer seeing themselves as isolated victims. They were starting to realize that they shared common experiences and common enemies. "Thecamore," Jake said quietly, "how many prisoners are there on this ship?" The creature considered carefully. "In the arena levels, perhaps 300. In the general population levels, another 2,000. Most are scheduled for fights within the next few months." Jake felt his pulse quicken. He had been thinking in terms of individual escape, but those numbers suggested something much larger. "What species are represented?" "Dozens," Thecamore replied. "Refugees from conquered worlds, political prisoners, beings who were captured during raids like yours. Most have been conditioned to believe that resistance is hopeless. But conditioning can be broken," Jake said. "You proved that." Over the following days, their situation became increasingly desperate. Mitchell brought in new opponents designed to test specific aspects of their cooperation. swarm creatures that required constant communication to defeat, puzzle-based challenges that demanded both human creativity and Vorak analytical thinking. Each test was more dangerous than the last, and each victory made Mitchell more desperate. But something unexpected was happening in the audience. Instead of bloodthirsty entertainment, spectators were witnessing repeated demonstrations of interspecies cooperation. The crowds began cheering not for violence, but for the moments when Jake and Thekmore worked together most effectively. Mitchell's betting pools collapsed as people stopped wagering on death and started celebrating life. His carefully crafted entertainment empire was being transformed into something he had never intended, a symbol of hope for oppressed beings throughout the galaxy. On the 7th day, Mitchell played his final card. Jake and Thekmore were brought to the arena to find it completely empty except for 2 items in the center: a single weapon and a molecular disintegrator programmed to activate in exactly 10 minutes. Mitchell's voice echoed through the empty space, speaking only to them. One of you will take the weapon and kill the other. The survivor will be released to fight again tomorrow. If neither acts within 10 minutes, you will both be disintegrated at the molecular level. There will be no remains, no dignity, no memory of your defiance. Jake stared at the weapon, a simple plasma pistol with enough charge for 1 shot. Beside him, Thekmore stood completely still, his breathing calm and steady. Neither moved toward the weapon. 5 minutes, Mitchell announced. Jake turned to his friend and smiled. I want you to know, he said, that meeting you has been the best thing to happen to me since my capture. You helped me remember what it means to be human. Thekmore's large eyes met Jake's gaze. And you helped me remember what it means to be Vorak. More importantly, you helped me understand what it means to be friends. 3 minutes. They began to speak, not to Mitchell or to any hidden audience, but to each other. Jake told Thekmore about Earth's seasons, about the way snow looked when it fell on pine trees. Thekmore described the mathematical beauty of his homeworld's architecture, the way crystalline buildings grew from geometric principles that human minds could barely comprehend. 1 minute. Neither had moved toward the weapon. Around the galaxy, recordings of their conversations were being broadcast on underground networks. Their words were being translated into hundreds of languages, shared by resistance movements on dozens of worlds. Without knowing it, they had become symbols of something larger than themselves. 30 seconds. Jake reached out and took Thekmore's hand. The texture was strange against his human skin, but the gesture's meaning was universal. They had chosen friendship over survival, cooperation over competition, love over fear. 10 seconds. The molecular disintegrator began its activation sequence, filling the arena with an ominous humming sound. But as the final countdown began, something unprecedented happened. The arena doors burst open and prisoners flooded onto the floor. Led by beings from a dozen different species, the uprising that Jake and Thekmore had unknowingly inspired finally erupted. They had spent 7 days demonstrating that cooperation between different species was not only possible but powerful. Now hundreds of prisoners were putting that lesson into practice. The molecular disintegrator's targeting system, designed for 2 specific individuals, was overwhelmed by the sudden crowd. Its safety protocols engaged, shutting down the weapon rather than risk an uncontrolled detonation that could damage the ship. In the chaos that followed, Mitchell's guards found themselves facing not individual prisoners, but coordinated groups, working together with strategies that none of them had ever encountered. Human tactical thinking combined with Vorak analytical precision. Refugee survivors sharing knowledge of Zephyrian weaknesses with beings who had the strength to exploit them. The battle for the ship lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Governor Mitchell found himself in the same cell where Jake had spent his first weeks of captivity. The former prisoners had taken control of the ship's systems and were broadcasting their story throughout the galaxy. Jake stood in Mitchell's former office, looking out at the arena floor where maintenance crews were removing the fighting equipment. Forever. Beside him, Theckmore was working with representatives from dozens of species to coordinate similar uprisings on other prison ships. "Governor Mitchell," Jake said as he entered the man's cell for a final conversation. "You wanted to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object." Mitchell looked up from where he sat on the narrow cot. His expensive clothes were torn and dirty, his face marked with bruises from his capture. But there was something different in his eyes now. The cruel confidence had been replaced by something that might have been understanding. "I never expected them to become friends," Mitchell said quietly. "That was your mistake," Jake replied. "You saw us as entertainment, as objects to be used for profit. You never considered that we might see each other as people." Theckmore appeared in the doorway, his large frame filling the entrance to the cell. Mitchell flinched, clearly expecting violence. But Theckmore simply looked down at the man who had orchestrated years of torture and spoke with quiet dignity. "I could kill you now," Theckmore said. "For 3 years, you forced me to kill beings who had done nothing wrong. You profited from my pain and the death of innocents." Mitchell's hands shook as he waited for the killing blow that never came. "But I am not the beast you tried to create," Theckmore continued. "I am Theckmore, mathematician and father. I choose to be more than my pain, more than my anger. I choose to build rather than destroy." He turned away from the cell, leaving Mitchell alive but forever changed. The former governor would spend his remaining years working to undo the damage. His entertainment empire had caused, driven not by fear but by the example of mercy he had been shown by those he had wronged. Governor Mitchell paced his office like a caged animal, his face red with rage and frustration. Through his window he could see the arena below, empty and quiet in the morning light. But the silence was deceptive. Word of yesterday's failed. Fight had spread throughout the ship and beyond. Betting pools were collapsing, spectators were demanding refunds, and his superiors were asking uncomfortable questions. "Bring them both," he ordered his head of security, a scarred Zephyrian named Commander Vex. "I want them in the arena in 1 hour." "Sir," Vex replied carefully, "the crowds are expecting something special. They feel cheated by yesterday's events." Mitchell slammed his fist on his desk, causing expensive ornaments to rattle. "Then we give them something special. Bring me the Hellhounds." Commander Vex went pale. The Hellhounds were Mitchell's secret weapon, genetically modified war beasts that had been bred specifically for hunting Vorak physiology. They had never been used in the arena because they were too dangerous, too unpredictable. They were meant for execution, not entertainment. "Sir, the insurance costs alone if those things get into the crowd." "I do not care about insurance," Mitchell snapped. "My prize fighter has been contaminated by this human somehow. Either they both die, or I lose everything I have built here. Bring me 6 Hellhounds." An hour later, Jake was dragged from his cell by guards who seemed more nervous than usual. They fitted him with the same battered armor as before, but this time they also gave him additional weapons: a plasma rifle with a nearly drained power cell, and a vibro knife that hummed with deadly energy. The extra armament was not a kindness. It was a sign of how dangerous his upcoming opponents would be. In the preparation room, Jake could hear unusual sounds coming from below the arena, snarling and howling that made his skin crawl. Whatever Mitchell was planning, it was not going to be a standard fight. Through the small window, Jake saw that the arena floor had been modified overnight. Metal barriers had been erected around the perimeter, creating a closed system with no escape routes. The sand had been replaced with bare metal flooring that showed dark stains where powerful acids had been used to clean away evidence of previous experiments. The crowd was larger than Jake had ever seen it. Word of the mysterious human and the silent one had spread throughout the entertainment networks. Beings from across the galaxy had traveled here to witness what was being advertised as the ultimate test of interspecies cooperation. Jake tested his weapons methodically, checking the plasma rifle's charge and the vibro knife's edge. His military training told him to prepare for the worst possible scenario. The sounds from below the arena suggested that the worst was exactly what Mitchell had planned. Across the preparation area, Theckmore was going through his own pre-fight routine. But his behavior was different now, where once he had moved with mechanical precision. Now there was hesitation in his gestures. His hands shook slightly as he flexed his claws, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. "Theckmore!" Jake called through the barriers separating them. The creature looked up, his large eyes meeting Jake's gaze. In those eyes, Jake saw fear. Not the programmed responses of a broken mind, but genuine emotional terror. Theckmore was feeling again, which meant he could be hurt again. "Whatever happens out there," Jake said, "remember who you are. Remember your family. Remember that you chose to be more than what they tried to make you." Theckmore nodded slowly. "And you remember that you are not alone. We face this together." The arena gates began to open. Jake walked onto the metal floor, his weapons ready, but his heart racing. The crowd's roar was deafening, but underneath it he could hear something else. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the arena floor itself. Across from him, Theckmore emerged from his gate. The creature moved carefully, his 6 arms positioned defensively. His head swiveled constantly, scanning for threats. His enhanced senses were detecting something that Jake's human physiology could not yet perceive. Governor Mitchell's voice boomed over the speakers, introducing the evening's special event. He spoke of testing the bonds between species, of seeing how far cooperation could go when faced with true adversity. His words were designed to build excitement, but Jake could hear the underlying cruelty in every sentence. Then the floor in the center of the arena began to open. The Hellhounds emerged from below like nightmares given form. Each one was the size of a small vehicle, with midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light. Their heads were elongated and filled with teeth that dripped with natural acid, 6 legs ending in claws that could tear through metal, eyes that glowed red in the arena lighting. But most terrifying of all was their purpose. These creatures had been bred specifically to hunt Vorak physiology. They could track Theckmore's scent from miles away. Their saliva contained toxins that were particularly effective against his species, and their pack-hunting instincts had been enhanced beyond natural levels. 6 of them circled Jake and Theckmore with predatory intelligence. They had been starved for days to increase their aggression, and their handlers had been feeding them samples of Vorak tissue to focus their hunting instincts. "This is not a fight," Jake said quietly, as the beasts completed their circle. "This is an execution." Theckmore's breathing became even more rapid. Jake could see the creature's body beginning to shake as primal fear responses awakened after 3 years of suppression. The psychological conditioning that had turned him into a killing machine was breaking down, leaving him vulnerable to the very emotions that the arena was designed to exploit. "I cannot do this," Thekmor whispered. "I am remembering too much. The fear, the pain, the loss. I cannot make myself fight like I used to." Jake raised his plasma rifle and checked the power indicator again. Maybe 20 shots if he was lucky. Against 6 genetically modified killing machines, it would not be nearly enough. "Then do not fight like you used to," Jake said. "Fight like who you really are. Fight like Thekmor the mathematician, the father, the being who sees patterns in the universe." One of the hellhounds stopped circling and focused its attention on Thekmor. Its muscles tensed as it prepared to attack. Jake could see intelligence in its glowing eyes, a cruel awareness that seemed almost human in its malicious intent. "Thekmor," Jake said urgently, "I need you to listen to me. Can you hear the mathematical patterns in their movement?" The creature's head turned slightly. Despite his fear, his analytical mind began to engage. "Yes," he said slowly. "They are using pack-hunting algorithms, predictable spacing, coordinated timing." "Then we can predict their attacks," Jake replied. "We can use their own patterns against them." The first hellhound launched itself at Thekmor with impossible speed. But instead of meeting it with brute force, Thekmor did something unexpected. He began to recite mathematical equations in his native language, complex formulas that described orbital mechanics and quantum interactions. The equations seemed to calm him, to center his mind and push away the paralyzing fear. His 6 arms moved in coordinated patterns, deflecting the hellhound's attack with minimal force while positioning himself for a counterstrike. Jake opened fire with his plasma rifle, targeting the second beast as it tried to flank them. His shots were precise and economical, each one aimed at vulnerable joints and sensory organs, rather than attempting to kill outright. As the battle continued, something remarkable happened. Jake found himself adapting to Thekmor's mathematical recitations, timing his own attacks to match the rhythm of the alien equations. Thekmor, in turn, began to incorporate human tactical concepts into his ancient formulas, creating hybrid strategies that neither species could have developed alone. They were not just fighting together, they were thinking together, creating something new from the combination of human adaptability and Vorak analytical precision. The hellhounds were powerful and vicious, but they had been bred to fight individual opponents using fear and overwhelming force. They were not prepared for cooperative tactics, for opponents who shared information instantly and adapted their strategies in real time. When Jake's plasma rifle finally ran out of charge, Thekmor was there to cover him. When one of the beasts managed to wound Thekmor with its acidic claws, Jake used his vibro knife to drive it back. They moved like parts of a single organism, anticipating each other's needs and responding without conscious thought. The crowd had gone completely silent. This was not the brutal spectacle they had expected. Instead, they were witnessing something unprecedented in the arena's history. 2 beings from different worlds, working together not just to survive, but to protect each other. As the last hellhound fell to their combined efforts, Jake and Thekmor stood together in the center of the arena, breathing heavily but alive. Around them lay the bodies of creatures that had been specifically designed to kill them. But the most important victory was not over the hellhounds. It was the look in Thekmor's eyes as he turned to Jake with something that had been absent for 3 years. Hope. The arena floor felt different under Jake's feet than he had expected. The sand was coarse and mixed with something that made it stick together. He realized with disgust that it was probably dried blood from countless previous fights. The smell hit him next, a mixture of death and disinfectant that the cleaning crews used between matches. Thousands of eyes watched him from the stands. Jake had performed military operations before, but never with an audience. The noise was overwhelming. At first, a wall of sound that seemed to press against his eardrums. Alien voices cheered and booed in languages he did not understand, but their excitement was universal. They wanted to see blood. Across the arena, the Silent One stood motionless near its gate. Up close, the creature was even more imposing than it had appeared from Jake's cell window. Its black scales seemed to absorb light, making it look like a shadow given form. The 6 arms hung at different angles, each ending in claws that gleamed like polished knives. Its head turned slightly as it studied Jake with those large, intelligent eyes. The crowd expected Jake to charge forward with his sword raised, screaming a battle cry like so many fighters before him. Instead, he did something that had never happened in the Crimson Coliseum's 3-year history. He sat down. Jake crossed his legs and placed his sword on the sand in front of him. He ignored the confused murmur from the crowd and focused entirely on the creature across from him. The Silent One tilted its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost curious. It took 1 step forward, then stopped. "I know you can understand me," Jake said, his voice calm and steady. "I have been watching you for weeks. You are not what they think you are." The creature remained motionless, but Jake caught something in its posture. A slight tension, as if his words had affected it somehow. The crowd's confusion was growing. Louder. This was not the entertainment they had paid to see. Jake began to speak about Earth. He described the blue oceans and white clouds, the way sunlight looked when it filtered through forest leaves. He talked about the music that humans created, how mathematical patterns could become beautiful sounds that touched the soul. He spoke of literature and art, of the ways intelligent beings express thoughts and emotions through creativity. The Silent One took another step forward, then another. Its movement was different now, less mechanical and more curious. The crowd began to quiet as they sensed something unusual happening. Even Governor Mitchell leaned forward in his luxury box, his face showing confusion and growing anger. "They broke you," Jake continued, his voice gentle but clear. "Someone took away everything you were and tried to turn you into a weapon. But I can see it in your eyes. The real you is still in there." The creature was now halfway across the arena. It moved slowly, each step deliberate. Its claws remained, extended, but there was no aggression in its posture. If anything, it seemed hesitant, as if approaching something dangerous rather than prey. Jake talked about choice. He explained how humans believed that every intelligent being had the right to decide their own path in life. He spoke of dignity and respect, concepts that had been stripped away from both of them by their Zephyrian captors. The creature stopped just 10 feet away, close enough that Jake could see his reflection in its dark scales. For several long minutes, they remained like that. Jake sitting calmly on the blood-soaked sand, speaking of philosophy and freedom. The Silent One standing motionless, its alien head tilted as if trying to understand not just the words, but the meaning behind them. The crowd's patience finally ran out. Governor Mitchell's voice boomed over the arena's speakers, demanding that the fight begin immediately. When neither combatant moved, he activated the punishment system built into the arena floor. Electric shocks surged through Jake's body, causing his muscles to spasm and his teeth to clench. The pain was intense, designed to force fighters into action through sheer agony. But Jake gritted his teeth and continued talking, his voice strained but unbroken. "This is what they do to us," he gasped between waves of electricity. "They use pain to make us forget who we are, but we do not have to let them win." The creature flinched as if the electricity was affecting it too, though Jake could see no visible current running through its body. Its hands clenched and unclenched, and for the first time since Jake had been watching, it showed signs of emotional distress. Mitchell increased the power. Jake's vision blurred as the electricity coursed through him, but he forced himself to keep talking. He spoke of his brother Danny, who had died defending their home colony from a Zephyrian attack. He described how Danny had faced impossible odds with courage and humor, refusing to let fear change who he was. "My brother knew he was going to die," Jake said through clenched teeth. "But he chose to die as himself, not as what his enemies wanted him to become." The Silent One's breathing changed. The steady mechanical rhythm that Jake had observed for weeks became faster and more irregular. Its claws retracted slightly, and its head moved from side to side as if trying to shake off some invisible weight. Mitchell's voice crackled over the speakers again, ordering the guards to use more severe methods. But before they could act, something unprecedented happened. The creature that had never made a sound in 3 years of fighting opened its mouth and spoke. "Stop." The word was barely a whisper, spoken in accented but clear human language. The arena fell completely silent. Even the background hum of the ship's engines seemed to pause. The Silent One looked down at Jake with eyes that were no longer empty of emotion. "Please stop hurting him," the creature said, its voice gaining strength. It turned toward Mitchell's luxury box. "I will not fight this one. He has done nothing wrong." The crowd erupted in chaos. Some spectators were angry at being cheated of their expected violence. Others seemed fascinated by this unprecedented turn of events. Mitchell's face turned red with rage as he realized his perfect killing machine was malfunctioning. The governor activated every punishment system in the arena simultaneously. Electricity, sonic pulses, and chemical irritants flooded the fighting area. But instead of forcing compliance, the torture seemed to have the opposite effect. The creature moved to shield Jake with its large body, absorbing the worst of the punishment itself. "My name is Thekmore," it said, speaking through obvious pain. "I was not always what you see now." Jake struggled to his feet, his body shaking from the electrical torture. He placed one hand on the creature's arm, feeling the strange texture of its scales. "I know you were not," he said. "I could see it in your eyes." Mitchell's voice boomed over the speakers, promising death to both of them if they did not fight. Immediately. But his threats seemed empty now. The crowd was more interested in this strange development than in traditional violence. Many were recording everything, and Jake knew the footage would spread throughout the galaxy within hours. "They will kill us both for this," Thekmore said quietly. Jake nodded. "Probably. But at least we will die as ourselves, not as what they tried to make us." The creature looked down at him with something that might have been gratitude. "You are very small for something so brave. You are very large for something so gentle," Jake replied. Around them, the arena systems continued their punishment protocols, but both beings endured the pain without complaint. They had found something worth suffering for. In a place designed to strip away dignity and humanity, they had discovered that choice could not be taken away by force. It could only be surrendered willingly. Mitchell finally shut down the punishment. Systems, realizing they were having no effect. The crowd was restless but intrigued. This was unlike anything they had ever seen in the arena. Two beings from different species, different worlds, standing together against their oppressors. "Tomorrow," Mitchell's voice announced, "there will be consequences for this defiance." But Jake and Theckmore were no longer listening to threats. They were talking quietly to each other, sharing stories of their lost homes and fallen friends. For the first time in 3 years, the arena's most feared fighter was remembering what it meant to be more than a weapon. The real fight was just beginning.